Hey, Tom, can you still hear me? I'm assuming I'm still coming through.
Hey, Paul.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Oh,
Can you hear
good.
me okay?
Okay. I'm going to set the volume then in the room here.
Okay, great. And give me a second to get my slide deck up again.
Okay.
Just out of curiosity, how many folks attended your dinner tonight?
Hold off just a minute. I'm going to need this for a while. Yeah. Well, oh, I'm sorry. What was that?
How many folks attended your dinner?
The dinner? About 80, I guess.
Oh,
Pretty good
wonderful.
turnout.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I think we're ready. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Hello? There it is. If you have a question you'd like to ask, just put your hand up and I'll bring you over to the mic, and Paul can hear your questions in Bozeman. A little bit of technology here. Paul is a professor in the Department of Political Science at MSU, and his primary focus is in working with communities on climate change resiliency, diversity and inclusion, and social justice topics. And that's his talk tonight is really going to be about how communities can come together and things that we can do to work more strongly around the climate change issue as a community. He earned a PhD in forestry at the University of Montana's College of Forestry and Conservation with a focus on natural resource policy and governance, and is an editor of the Community Development Society Current Issues book series, member of the board of directors and past president of the International Association for Community Development. Some years ago, he started this organization called Climate Smart Montana, and I would recommend that you go on, just kind of Google and find it. It's a wealth of information. It's very well organized. He is a linchpin in bringing people together, putting on programs, mostly on Zoom, around the state, elsewhere, bringing a wealth of information on the whole issue of how we can actually maybe turn this thing around a little bit with climate action. So I'm going to turn this over to Paul. He's been waiting patiently there in Bozeman. Paul, you're on.
All right, thank you very much. I guess the first question is, can you hear me okay? Is the volume all right? I'll assume it is, unless I hear otherwise. So it is a pleasure to be with you, and I'm excited to be with you virtually. And again, in the interest of carbon footprint, I chose to do this via Zoom and not to be with you in person. So I hope you'll indulge me in that request. But I do hope that we can engage in a robust conversation at the end. So I'll keep my presentation fairly short, about 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes, and then hopefully you'll have some questions for me. I do want to start by thanking the organizers of this event, and in particular, Dave Hemian, for the invitation. And I also want to thank all of you for showing up. And I understand that this parish, that you really are the embodiment of a community, that you have an open door policy to the public and also to hosting music. And I know this because my sweetheart, Carrie Krause, is a violinist. She's a Baroque violinist, and I understand that she's performed in the church several times. So thank you for joining tonight in person in the church and also online for those of you that are on YouTube. So tonight I'm going to talk to you about challenges, and I also want to talk about opportunities. So I don't want to talk about just the negative, but also what we can do positively to move forward in our communities, to organize around what is described as an existential threat, the most critical issue facing us in our generation, and really facing us in all of human history. We don't have much time. I think all of you know that, to turn around the carbon emissions and the potential for what many people are saying is catastrophic climate disruption. It is up to us, those of us in this room, in our communities, to make each other aware and to plan and engage and act in a way that will turn this problem around. As was mentioned, I'm a professor at Montana State University, and also a host of this network, Climate Smart Montana. We have well over 150 individuals that are part of this network. And again, if you Google rather Climate Smart Montana, you'll come to our website. You can join our listserv. We have monthly meetings, and we are always looking to host professionals or citizens, anyone who has anything to offer each month to the network. And we've recorded all of our monthly meetings, the formal presentations and conversations, and you can access all those again on our website if you Google it, or go to my website, and you can access that via the link that I've presented here. I just want to reference real quick the photo that I'm presenting in this first slide. This is a picture of what was called the Earthrise, that was taken on December 24th, 1968 by the crew of the Apollo 8 spacecraft that was circling the moon. And so tonight, when we're thinking about community, I'll be defining community in just a minute. But I want us to think of our entire Earth as a community of people, of places, of interests and identities, of the past, of the present, and hopefully of the future, that can work together for positive change. And this is the work that I'm involved in at the university in my classes, in terms of community development and the climate change perspective that I try to bring to people, that it really is all about community if we're going to solve this, if we're going to address this problem. I want to start by with a message to the young people in the audience, and hopefully there are some young people in the audience. You had a dinner earlier that was where you were discussing and raising awareness about the Held v. State of Montana case that is pending. And I like to start these kinds of presentations with a solemn and heartfelt apology to the young people in the room, because my generation has let you down getting into this situation, the situation where we are. There is no way that we are going to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius at this point. This is considered by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to be the safe threshold by which climate disruption starts to become much more acute and hard to prevent. And at this point, it is fairly well recognized by the scientific community that there is no way that we'll be staying below 1.5. And in fact, with our current trajectory, and even with our Paris Accord commitments, we will be sailing right past 2 degrees Celsius. And so what does that mean? Even under the most optimistic scenarios, so a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in global temperatures will have significant impact on the climate. And we're already starting to see those now here in Montana and around the world. But a 2 degrees Celsius increase will be far worse. So for every increment of global warming, changes in extremes will become even larger and more exaggerated. So for example, an extreme heat event that occurred once per decade in a climate without human influence will happen over 4 times a decade at 1.5 degrees warming, and it will happen at 5.6 degrees more often at 2 degrees. Again, this is all according to the IPCC reporting. Warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius will destroy at least 70% of coral reefs, but at 2 degrees Celsius, more than 99% of coral reefs will be lost. That, of course, will destroy fish habitats and the communities that rely on those reefs for their food and livelihoods. So as the world heats up, the risk increases that the planet will reach what we call tipping points. And this is where the Earth systems will cross these critical thresholds that many scientists are saying can and will be irreversible and cascading impacts. And exactly when these points occur is uncertain at this point. Well, let me start off the presentation now with just defining communities. And oftentimes when we think of communities, we think of communities of place. These are geographies, where we live, the kind of political jurisdictions that define the places that we inhabit. But I also want to talk about communities of purpose, and these are defined, and I'd like you to think of these tonight as communities of interest. And tonight we're gathered here, and I'm assuming most of us have an interest in climate change. We could have an interest in urban planning or gardening. Communities can also be defined in terms of our identity, the way that we the way that we kind of characterize ourselves. Could be we identify as allies or within the LGBTQ plus community, or we identify as environmentalists, or communities of practice. And these are more professional types of positions, engineers and architects and those kinds of things. So as we talk about community tonight, I invite you to think of more than just communities of geography and place, but also communities of interest, identity, and practice. So I'm going to share with you now my two take-home messages, and I like to share my take-home message right off the bat, and we'll revisit this when we finish. And I think this is best exemplified by Bill McKibben. He's an author, an environmental activist, the founder of 350.org, and most recently an organization called Third Act. Bill McKibben has said, quote, "The most effective thing you can do about climate change as an individual is to stop being an individual." And what he means by this is that we need to work together. We need to come together within our various communities, whether it's our communities of place or our communities of purpose. Because, for example, withdrawing from the Paris Accord, where one country is going to go at it alone, is frankly an utter failure. We cannot be individuals, whether it's as nations or as people, to try to solve this problem. The second message I'd like to leave you with is by Katharine Hayhoe, and she is an atmospheric scientist based at Texas Tech University. And by the way, I've provided all the links to the quotes and that I'll be giving tonight. So I will share this with Dave, and you can ask him for a copy of this presentation so that you don't have to copy down the small font. Katharine Hayhoe says that the most important thing that you can do to fight climate change is talk about it. So my take-home message is, number one, community matters when it comes to climate change. And number two, we need to talk about this. We need to communicate, and we need to engage. Okay. On the second point, in terms of communication, the Yale Climate Change Communications Project has been doing polling across the United States for many, many years. One of the questions that they've asked is, and you can see here, the percent of adults who discuss global warming at least occasionally is a dismal 35%. You can see how that's distributed by county across the United States, with a couple of outliers that are in the maybe 50 or 60% in Seattle, San Francisco. We are not doing a good job across the United States of engaging and talking about, of discussing this issue of climate change. We can do much better, and we can do that within our communities, our various communities. Now I'd like to share with you a little bit about my own personal community, a community that I've been involved in now at Montana State University for 16 years as a professor. And I want to reference the Great Charter of Universities. This is a document that was signed in Italy in 1988, and it explicitly defines the fundamental principles upon which the mission of universities should be based. And this is something I take very, very seriously in my community at the university, interacting with my colleagues, faculty and students and administrators, and my outreach work like I'm doing tonight. This document has been signed by nearly 1,000 universities in over 90 countries around the world. And the text reads, quote, universities acknowledge that they have a responsibility to engage with and respond to the aspirations and challenges of the world and to the communities they serve to benefit humanity and contribute to sustainability. Universities declare their commitment to preservation of the planet and promoting health, prosperity, and enlightenment around the world. Now, I'm sorry to say that no universities within the Montana University system have signed on to this, to the Great Charter of Universities. And I think that's a real pity, because I think this really does embody the essence of what we do in universities, what I'm charged with as a community member in my community of faculty and within the community of academics at Montana State University. There's another organization that's issued a statement that does pertain very much specifically to my university, and that's from the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities, the APLU, and they declare that their universities, quote, all have the public purpose of educating students, undertaking research, and contributing solutions to the problems facing their regions, countries, and the international community at large. They are uniquely positioned to address the challenges and opportunities facing the continent and must contribute to the solutions and progress of the region through education, joint research, and collaborative problem solving. So I have been working with a group of about 60 faculty and students and staff and administrators, and we formed a new group called the Climate Solutions Group. So this is different than Climate Smart Montana, which tends to be open to citizens to engage in public discourse. Our Climate Solutions Group is specific to faculty, students, and staff, but we are open to the public. And so we operate on the principles of openness and transparency. So all of our meetings are accessible, and we invite you to participate. And again, you can access information about this group on my website and the address that I gave you earlier. So we created this group to provide opportunities to engage on the topic of climate change and to use our campus as a living lab. We want to promote education and research and outreach specifically on the topic of climate change. And I'm very proud to say that we are organizing activities next week called Climate Week, where we have over a dozen events. They are seminars, they are workshops, we have music, arts and crafts, and this is largely student-led to, again, raise awareness about the climate emergency that the universities, again, have a distinct responsibility to be addressing. Now, a core group of us wrote this op-ed back in September of 2022, and we were very critical of Montana State University administration. We note their lack of commitments in terms of climate change policies. We note that they have issued statements in the past that we need to keep our heads down. We had done work on a comprehensive sustainability plan, and we were told that there was, quote, too much public-facing detail in this sustainability plan that had emissions reduction targets. And so we wrote 5 recommendations in this guest op-ed. And these recommendations are for our university community specifically, but these 5 recommendations also pertain to any community. So they could pertain to the community of Helena, they could pertain to your church, to any other communities of interest or identity or practice that you care to apply them to. So I'll reference these 5 recommendations again very broadly, and then I'll talk about specifically how they apply to the university. First of all, we recommended that the university publicly declare a climate emergency. And this would support a declaration that had been unanimously approved by the MSU faculty and student senate bodies in 2021. but has not been stated by MSU administration. So by doing this, we would be joining in solidarity with some 7,000 universities around the world. And we felt that this declaration would help incentivize local and state level climate action. So this is an activity that any community can do. Your church could declare a climate emergency, or as far as I know, I don't think Helena, the government, the local government or the county government has issued a climate emergency. And so this is something that citizens could push for. The second recommendation that we made in this op-ed was for fundraising. And we talked about initiating a climate fundraising effort similar to a hugely successful effort that had taken place back in 2019, where MSU raised almost $500 million in a campaign called What It Takes. And we felt that a similar campaign could be initiated by our senior administrators at Montana State University. And this campaign would fund scholarships, it could initiate new programs of study, and most importantly, it would help decrease our carbon footprint on campus, and it would serve as an example to our communities all across the state of Montana about the innovation and creativity that could take place on a university campus and could be applied in commercial and residential settings all across the state. So again, any community could do this. You could start a green fund, or you could even think about this in terms of your bequest. Where are your funds going? How can you best leverage those funds to address climate change issues in your community? The third recommendation we made in this op-ed was that any work that's done on climate change has to be open and transparent. It has to be accessible to the public. And in fact, this is a fundamental tenet of climate justice principles, is that the people who are most vulnerable must be included in the planning and the initiation of any climate action. So we feel that agendas, meetings, and minutes must be public at MSU, and we're still struggling to make sure that that's the case. We're making some progress there, but not a lot of progress in terms of accessibility to data and meetings and minutes. The fourth thing that we recommended was that MSU should initiate a climate action plan. The last plan that we had was in 2011. And of course, as you can imagine, a plan that's 12 years old is outdated based on the new science and the new technology that's available. And that any new plan had to have detailed benchmarks and verifiable metrics that had to be revisited annually. MSU is now committed to an energy plan. They won't call it a climate action plan, but we don't know any of the details of what might be in the the energy plan, and how it might address issues of climate justice, issues of curriculum development, and other related things that don't pertain to energy. So again, this is something that any community can do. You can initiate a climate action plan at your church to become zero carbon, not carbon neutral, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute. And that's something that, again, you can push with your local governments in Helena and the county. And the fifth recommendation we made in this op-ed was a commitment to education, that we have to talk about this issue. And our specific requirement was that we need to have climate change be part of our university core requirements. Our university core requirements have not changed in 18 years. So the incoming freshmen that are required to take certain courses at Montana State University are subject to the same core requirements that were in place when they were in utero. So think about that. Think about the changes in the world and the lack of change that we've seen here with our university core curriculum. And again, this is something that can be applied to any community. Talking about educating and mutual learning, coming to common understandings particularly when there's differences between individuals about what the problem is and how we resolve the problem. Communication and education is absolutely key as we move forward. So there are three things that I've learned in my 16 years as a faculty member at Montana State University that I want to share with you. And these apply, of course, to my university community, but I think these apply to any community that we've been talking about, communities of place or communities of purpose. The first is that I see a lot of my colleagues are reticent, particularly the decision makers in my institution, reticent to take a public stance on the climate emergency. And many are choosing to be risk averse and to keep this this attitude of keep your head down, less public facing detail, again because of the quote unquote threats of public perception that we're being too much of a activists or too progressive. The second thing I've noticed is that many of my colleagues are self-censoring. They recognize the urgency and the threats of the situation and the need for what the IPCC has said for immediate, rapid, and sustained response to the climate crisis. But again, choose to not raise their voices about this. And the third thing that I've noticed is that the fossil fuel industry has been very successful in capturing the interests of many in the academy. What we call academic capture, a scholarly term that I'm working on a paper right now to try to flush out this idea, like elite capture or regulatory capture, academic capture. And there is conclusive evidence that universities that are fossil fuel funded or receive fossil fuel funding are more favorable in their scholarship and their academic reporting towards the fossil fuel industry than the renewable energy industry, and that there are serious transparency issues regarding disclosure of this potential bias. For example, Ben Franta has written a piece for The Guardian several years ago. It was titled, quote, "The Fossil Fuel Industry's Invisible Colonialization of Academia." And in this piece, they claim, him and a colleague claim that, quote, "corporate capture of academic research by the fossil fuel industry is an elephant in the room," unquote. So I want to turn now to some of the challenges that communities face. And there's three challenges that I want to talk about that I think we should all be familiar with. This term of soft denialism. Of course, I think we're all familiar with kind of climate denialism, but there's a new term called soft denialism, a second term called mitigation delay, and lastly, offsets and carbon neutrality and net zero that I'll talk about briefly. So we've created the pretext for what an author, Michael Hochster, has coined soft denialism. And this involves acknowledging the science and the risks, yet continuing to promote solutions that are in no way commensurate to the acknowledged threats. And this is done through ineffectual actions or indecisive steps. So that's soft denialism. Similarly, Kevin Anderson, who's an academic from the University of Manchester, he describes mitigation delay, and he says that this is the new denialism. He defines this term as a failure to act in accordance with the science. Similarly, even though the information exists and the means to reduce emissions are available, we have the tools available to us, is what he's saying. We just lack the political will. So mitigation delayed is deeply embedded in universities, he says, and academia. Quote, "In my view, it is far more dangerous than climate denialism and skepticism," unquote. Again, that's from Kevin Anderson. And the last thing, and Anderson goes on to say, and he talks about offsets and carbon neutrality and net zero, and there is a plethora of scholarship now coming out, very critical of offsets and carbon neutrality and the term net zero. For Anderson, offsets are, quote, worse than doing nothing. He says they, quote, lack scientific legitimacy and are dangerously misleading since they almost certainly contribute to a net increase in the absolute rate of global emissions growth, unquote. So many of us that are starting to study the issue of offsets and carbon neutrality and net zero, we see this as nothing less than greenwashing. And so many academics are saying, don't be fooled by these claims that a particular community or institution or organization is making when they claim to be carbon neutral or net zero or using offsets to try to get to carbon neutrality. Let me offer you a few quotes here. This one by White and Rathie, they report that, quote, study after study has indicated that most offsets available on the market don't reliably reduce emissions. For Lee, he asserts that a net zero target means less incentive to get to real zero emissions from fossil fuels. He calls this an escape hatch that perpetuates business as usual and delays more meaningful action. And then for Anderson, net zero has undermined the need for immediate and pressing action. He says you unpick the rhetoric and what you find underneath it is just a vacuous, empty space. He goes on to say carbon neutrality goals are passing the burden on to the next generation. For the richer parts of the world, if we are to deliver on our 1.5 degrees Celsius commitment, then we need to be zero emissions, not net zero, but zero emissions from energy by around 2030. And the last quote I'll say to you, and this is a piece by Skelton et al. Skelton and another 40 scientists who have been studying this issue of net zero. He says that, quote, they say rather, in practice, net zero targets several decades into the future shift our focus away from the immediate and unprecedented emission reductions needed. Net zero targets are generally premised on the assumption that fossil fuel emissions can be compensated for by carbon offsetting and unproven future technologies for removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. But offsetting does not cancel out our emissions. Yet action to do so is immediately needed. Major and unprecedented reductions in emissions are needed now. So the question I ask is, why are we reticent? Why do we self-censor? And why is the fossil fuel industry so effective at capturing our communities? Well, for those of you that are familiar with Naomi Oreskes' work, her work with Eric Conway, Merchants of Doubt, they go into a great deal of detail about the tobacco industry and the manipulation of data and public opinion to sow the seeds of doubt. Noam Chomsky has also talked about manufacturing consent more generally, about how the mass media has produced a consumeristic culture that we really just kind of keep our heads down and don't focus on these big issues. But I want to offer one theory that I think is another lens to understand this issue by John Jost. He's written a book called A Theory of System Justification. It's been reviewed by multiple academics in many journals, described as having far-reaching implications and numerous insights that activists and social justice advocates can use to promote change. And this is what Jost says. Jost says that the notion of this notion of social justification is based on this idea that an individual's evaluations of our broader social systems and institutions are very much influenced by our needs, our individual needs, to have a sense of certainty and stability. That we have needs, existential needs, to feel safety and reassurance. And we also have relational needs to affiliate with others who are part of our same social system. So against our better judgment, oftentimes Joyce says that, quote, people are motivated, often unconsciously, without deliberate intention or awareness, to defend, justify, and bolster aspects of the status quo, including existing social, economic, and political institutions and arrangements, unquote. So what Joyce is getting at here is that it's really hard to go against groupthink, to think, um, to think as a small group of individuals, and to raise your voice, to agree with the overwhelming consensus of scientists. And this is why we see that broad departure between the scientific consensus, which is between 97, 99, and some studies point to 100% consensus that climate change is happening, it's real, it's caused by humans, it's serious, and it's potentially catastrophic. On the one hand, and public opinion, where we still have vast differences of opinion across the United States, particularly our conservative political, across the political conservative political spectrum, that deny the existence of climate change, or that it's really a serious problem. So I think this theory of system justification is really one way, one lens to understand, better understand how we can try to get away from groupthink and think in terms of small communities and build that support for engaging and talking about climate change. Well, let me leave you with some parting thoughts here and some concluding statements, and then I hope we can open this up to discussion. The first thing I want to talk about, and again, being a political scientist, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about Noam Chomsky, who has been very influential to me, and I think has some very relevant ideas as we move forward, as talking about what communities can do to address the climate crisis. In 1967, Noam Chomsky wrote one of his classic essays called "The Responsibility of Intellectuals," and in it he argues that intellectuals, and he would argue, and I would as well, that all of us participating in this webinar tonight would be considered intellectuals, because we have free time, we have access to information, and we have a degree of knowledge and experience that lends itself to calling ourselves intellectuals and moving the needle on the climate issue. All of us, Chomsky says, have responsibilities that go beyond those of others because we are relatively privileged and we have relatively privileged positions. And he proposes three primary responsibilities. The first one is to speak the truth and expose lies. The second responsibility is to provide historical context. And the third responsibility is to advance the boundaries of debate. So to speak the truth and expose lies, that would be, for example, we would counter the soft denial. We would challenge the mitigation delay that we're seeing in our various communities. To provide a historical context, we would simply talk and educate ourselves in our communities about science and the trends that we're seeing, the historical trends that lend themselves to our current body of knowledge and understanding about the climate crisis. And third, to advance the boundaries of debate, that we would communicate in every opportunity that we have, in every community that we have, to again to expand this conversation, particularly with those that may be disagreeable with this topic. But our responsibility to avoid mitigation delay and engage in the extraordinary societal reform that is necessary really is founded on this ability for us all to have the courage to tell the truth. And with that, I just want to leave you with some quotes by Martin Luther King, who I appreciate as a past leader who faced tremendous hardship and personal struggle. And he said, here he's looking out from his jail cell in Birmingham in the early 1960s. And he said, "Courage is an inner resolution to go forward despite obstacles. Courage breeds creativity, and there comes a time when we must take a position that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular, but one must take it because it is right. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. And he went on to say that an individual has not started living until he can rise above the narrow confines of his individual concerns and to the broader concerns of all humanity. So with that, my take-home message again is, as we take a look at this photo that was taken 4 years later from the photo I showed you in the first slide in 1972, this was the first time that humanity had a view of the entire Earth. We were able to witness the entire globe from space and realize how small we are and how connected we are. And again, in the words of Martin Luther King, that we are all caught in an inescapable network of community, or of mutuality rather, tied in a single garment of destiny. So my take-home message to all of you is, one, stop being an individual and focus on the community, and have the courage to boldly act and to address the climate emergency. Our fellow community members, particularly the youth of the present and the generations to come, will be indebted to you all for your courage. Thank you very much.
Well, Paul, thank you for bringing your message
So
this
now I'll be
evening
happy
to
to
us.
entertain any questions you might have or comments.
Okay, are you hearing me now? Are you
And
hearing
I
me?
can't hear anything right now, so I'll just wait for you to chime in.
We'll see what Tom can do. Tom? It's on the Zoom. Yeah, there's a feedback issue. Okay. You hearing now? Okay, good. Thank you. So we may have to go back and forth with some of the technology here, but one of the things that occurs to me is that part of the problem we have with becoming motivated enough to really take action is the gradualism of what is in front of us. We have, we go through a winter like this, we talk about weather, and the greater issue is the climate. And how do we get past our own hesitancy to be able to deal with that, and more importantly, those among us there, those others that really have just not grasped, because it is such a far in the distance reality.
So I heard most of that. It was a little bit difficult to hear. Something about hesitancy. How do we get by our own hesitancy?
Well, what I was trying to express here is part of the problem is that we're dealing with an issue that is not as day-to-day as so many other problems that we have with the catastrophe that you outlined. And so that is, it's not really, it's that delay maybe that you talked about. But how do we get beyond that to be able to address what is certainly in front of us that way?
I'm having a hard time hearing the question. I'm so sorry, and I think it's because maybe you're so far back in the church from the microphone. I'm not sure if you can get a microphone maybe a little bit closer to who's asking the question.
Okay, you think I need to move up here? I'm going to open the mic. Are there any questions? Can you hear us now? I was afraid of this. The mic is here and it goes up there. Are you hearing me now? Are you hearing this?
Yes, I am.
You're hearing this now? Okay, I just need
Yes,
to
I
be
am.
closer to the mic. I'm going to stop trying to deal with that. Are there other questions or thoughts you have that you'd like to share? Anybody? I mean, there was a lot that was stimulating and a lot to unpack.
I really appreciated the discussion about carbon offsets because from the very beginning, when we started seeing, that phrase being used, it seemed to me like it was just a trade-off, and it was not. It was making people feel good about what they're doing to buy this carbon offset. And it has always been a mystery, and I'm kind of gratified to hear that that seems like you're part of your conclusion also, that that's not helping the situation at all.
Yeah, so I'll be happy to talk about offsets a little bit more. Um, 5 years ago, we were not talking about this, was not part of the conversations that we were having. In terms of the conference of the parties, and the the, uh, the national goals that countries had. So this idea of net zero is really a fairly new term, and the same with offsets and the markets that go along with that. So there's been a lot of scrutiny in academia about what exactly this means. The point is, with offsets, is that we can show that we're quote unquote reducing our emissions by, for example, protecting a forest in Brazil, or some effort like this. But the problem is there's the standard to try to measure this and to try to account for these for these offsets, to try to get to net zero or carbon neutrality, um, is uh, is 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 under a lot of scrutiny, and is not being regulated by a, a governing body. So you've got a lot of different organizations that are in charge of this. The most important thing that we can be doing right now is stop putting carbon, greenhouse gases, into the atmosphere: methane, CO2, nitrous oxide, etc. So we um, what the scrutiny involves, that it may look good that Google or Apple or Coca-Cola is committing to these offsets or carbon neutrality, but the real question is, are they reducing their emissions, their carbon emissions? This is the mitigation delay that Anderson is talking about, and that we need to be focusing on. Are we putting less greenhouse gases into the atmosphere? And you can see that the trends are very clear, that we have leveled off, but we are not reducing at the rate that we need to. The IPCC says that we need to be reducing at 8% a year globally. And if we take our responsibility seriously in the United States as the major emitter, cumulative emitter, and per capita emitter of greenhouse gases, we should be doubling that. That should be 15% a year annual reductions. And I'll remind you, during the height of the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, the United States reduced emissions by roughly 6 to 7% that year. That's so. Imagine doubling that and doing that every year. That is the kind of mitigation of fossil fuel carbon emissions that we need to be doing right now. And there is no plan in place to be doing that. So we have a lot of work to do. I hope that addressed your question. Again, I had a little bit of trouble hearing you, but I'll see if I can hear the next question a little bit better. Thank you.
Anybody else want to take a crack? Yeah, I thought Max would. Max, I've been told you have to get up toward the altar with the mic to make it work.
Max, if you do that, try and move the cursor and take it off mute. Can you hear me, Paul?
Oh, that is much better. Much
Oh,
better.
you
Thank
know,
you
I'm
so
just-
much. Great.
We're pretending we're on Zoom talking to the computer, so bear with me because I'm gonna struggle with this a little bit. I mean, the offset example is a good one. You know, perceiving myself as an early adopter, I don't know, starting 20 years ago, offsets, all these things came along. We all ran to do them, and we told our friends about them, and our organizations pushed them, and a lot of national environmental groups pushed them. Now then, you know, the corporations adopt them, but as you say, the outcomes aren't what we thought we were going to get. There's something in that I think is part of the problem. You know, in the way maybe even the way we think about our communities. So I have two things that I've thought about that I want to just throw at you and see what you think. The first is a little bit, well, anyway, I'm reading a science fiction trilogy that starts with a book called The Three Body Problem by a Chinese writer. It's one, I think the first book of the trilogy or won the major science fiction awards. And the premise of the book is that there's a threat coming from another star. There's an alien civilization that's coming to Earth to take it. And Earth has 400 years to respond. And what's fascinating about the book is the way the author shows just what happens when the planet, you know, it's kind of like climate change. When the nations and local governments try to respond to this threat, you get everything from the peace, love, and let's all get along to the shoot first and ask questions later. He does a good job dissecting our contemporary politics. And I'm wondering if you assign science fiction to your students. Another book is the Ministry for the Future, which Kim Stanley Robinson, another celebrated writer, puts the book out in like 2045 and shows how we got through the climate crisis of the 2020s. It's really interesting to try to imagine how we get to this better place. So I'm just throwing that out as one thing. The other thing is the idea of community design. I've been trying to figure out how to make the case that the way we design our local communities, our land use planning, particularly around transportation, food, healthcare, is our biggest opportunity is through local government to affect our community's impact on our emissions here in the Helena Valley. But it's a whole different language of how you think about you design your community. But for example, it would be illegal to, well, I don't want to go there because that's where you run into trouble, but how we design transportation and where people live, of course, is going to impact our emissions. So is there anything going on at MSU interdisciplinary wise where community planners and geographers and political science and climate scientists are saying, gee, the Gallatin Valley is zero emissions in the year 2040. How did it happen? And I'll leave you with that.
Thanks for the question, and I hope folks in the audience could hear the question as well. You'd asked me about science fiction readings for my students, and I don't assign science fiction, and I guess I do that because it seems like reality is so much like science fiction these days. It's kind of hard to believe the lack of response and the situation that we've gotten ourselves in, because we've known about this situation for decades. And in fact, I talked to my students just in my last lecture about some of the Exxon mobile data. Exxon at the time in the 1970s came out with very sophisticated and conclusive evidence that raising CO2 levels past 300 and past 400 parts per million was going to have a direct correlation on surface temperature increases. And they chose to hide that data, and they continue to this day to downplay the severity of and the amount of research and development in proportion to exploration is still, of course, not at parity. So reality is just as strange as science fiction these days, it seems to me. But your books are well are acknowledged, and I appreciate the recommendations. In terms of your second part of your question about land use, how land use planning is tied to the climate crisis and transportation and what we might be doing at the university in terms of interdisciplinary work. Myself and members of the Climate Solutions Group are absolutely talking about the need to break down our silos in terms of departments and majors and degrees, and how we can start to set up more opportunities for interdisciplinary learning. And the institution is very rigid in terms of class structure and majors, and I'm working on a project, independent study project with 5 students this semester to do exactly that, to bring students from across campus together so that we can start to provide opportunities so that students can learn about the complexity of this issue. And I think you're exactly right. This issue touches everything from land use planning to agriculture to transportation to public health. And we're starting to recognize that. And like a big bowl of spaghetti, when you pull one piece, it's all kind of connected. And, we need to start thinking about that in terms of our local government structures as well, how we're doing our land use planning and how our local governments are structured and functioning. And I think it's good citizens like yourself to bring those points forward. Billings has done a great job, and we featured some of the colleagues in Billings who are working on conservation issues, who have been sanctioned by their local government to move these conversations forward, and to think about holistically how the issues all come together. Because all of you recognize water is going to be the key issue as we move forward in the 21st century in places like Helena and Bozeman and elsewhere, as the population increases and as these extreme weather events start to increase, and water becomes more of a resource that's in short supply. So I hope I answered your question. I appreciate you coming forward, because it was much easier to hear you when you came closer to the microphone. And again, I thank you for the question. I hope I addressed it.
Okay, Paul, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. One of the things you mentioned was sort of lack of response from your administration. And just remember that President Cruzado is having to do a little dance there with your community at the university and the Board of Regents, and the regents being put there by the governor. So it actually turns out it's all political. And right now we are dealing with a legislature that is in fact passing laws this very minute that are preventing municipalities from doing anything to try to put the brakes on pollution in their own communities. And I'm talking about water and air both. So how do we how do we get this message into the political arena without getting the amount of pushback that we're getting right now? And I think you're seeing that in your own community.
Thank you for that question. And, as a political scientist, this, that kind of task is not lost on me. I go back to our fundamental mission as a university, and this is why I started with the great charter of universities. Our fundamental mission, our purpose, our raison d'etre, our business plan is to look out for the health, welfare, and safety of our citizens. That's our prime directive for you folks that used to watch Star Trek. So if we're not doing that, if we negate that responsibility, that fiduciary, then we've already lost. As far as I'm concerned, we might as well pack our bags and go home. I didn't become a professor. I didn't become a member of the academy to keep my head down and to provide less public-facing detail. My responsibility as an academic, and I look to my colleagues in the academy, whether they're in administration or staff members, I look to them all to address the health, welfare, and safety of the citizens of this state. And I think we do a disservice to the people of this state when we keep our head down, when we play that political game. In fact, I think it's political to not talk about the issue. I think we have a moral duty, an ethical obligation. I would argue it's a legal obligation to talk about these issues, particularly if it's an existential threat. Now, I would not want the job of a university president or a provost, but I can tell you, I've personally faced issues of reprisals and recrimination for talking about climate change. But people that talk about climate change in academia, I look up to because I see them as having integrity of upholding our mission and our fiduciary to move this conversation forward. We are not going to change public opinion by not talking about this. So in my humble opinion, as a member of the academy, I feel it a duty, I would call it a sacred duty, to talk about this issue. And I have the utmost respect for my colleagues that share my opinion, that we have to talk about this issue and that we shouldn't be keeping our heads down. We should be holding our heads high and trying to change public opinion that way, because it can happen. And I can tell you that in a state like Utah, the university president has taken a very proactive state. And the state of Utah also has a supermajority of Republicans. We could argue about the context and the type of maybe conservative orientation that those people have in Utah. But there's no reason why we shouldn't, as citizens, be standing up, because it's up to us, all of us, to raise these issues. Most importantly, those of us in academia, to be leaders in this cause and to be champions of the science and of the truth, and to be not to be proponents of mitigation delay, but instead to be proponents of the science and of the academy and of what needs to be done. I hope I answered your question. I hope I wasn't too caustic with my attitude.
Any other points?
Oh, where did Paul go? Well, our sound left and our speaker left. So I'm gonna, if he comes back up.
I just want to raise one challenge that this group is for the community out is we are communities. We're part of a larger urban waves here, pastoral waves here. And we're going to be on there to talk about your faith activities, see what the stimulates and stuff. But I would give us all that challenge of what St. Paul's should be doing. Put an emphasis on it. We'll ask learn some things. If there's more to learn, I feel we could go strong. I know all of them. And we need to get collective leadership of this church, defining what it is. I think there's 5 points that we're calling community and accountability, basically, setting commitment in direction and mitigating that climate crisis. I would hope that you'll put the word out. Maybe we can convene a little, whatever it is. We really put our best efforts into coming up with something, because we already need community faith. That gives us the ability to communicate in a much more direct way with others in those communities to build that sense of, and we have this internal motivation. It's part of the illustration. We do that challenge. With us on that. With us on that. Thank you. What's that? Oh, I don't know what to do. Paul, can you hear?
Yes, I
you hear
can.
me? So, I think our
lack of
or our challenge with technology has been a little bit of a hindrance, but I just want to thank you so much for providing some outline for us as a faith community to go forward with some of the outline you've made of ways that we can work as a community. Thank you.
It's been my pleasure, and I'm happy to call on me again if there's anything else I can do. I'd be happy to collaborate. Such a joy to be a part of your community, and thank you again for the invitation.
Okay.
Thanks.